Elena stood on the glass balcony of her penthouse, her silhouette sharp against the metropolitan skyline. To her, the city was a canvas where she was the undisputed master. Every skyscraper she designed was a monument to her unyielding will. She didn't just build structures, she curated a lifestyle that mirrored her own perceived flawlessness. At 42, Elena had achieved what others spent lifetimes chasing. Her reputation was granite, and her control was absolute. She lived in a world where mistakes were for the mediocre, and she had long ago transcended such trivialities. Her home was the ultimate testament to this. A modern mansion of cold marble and floor-to-ceiling glass, it stood as a fortress of high-status achievement. Every angle was precise, every shadow calculated. Inside these walls, Elena felt invincible. The air always seemed thinner here, purified by the sheer height of her success. She moved through the corridors with the grace of a predator who had forgotten what it felt like to be hunted. This was her sanctuary of control, a physical manifestation of a career built on the belief that she could bend the laws of physics to her aesthetic desires. The first tremor in her reality didn't come from the earth, but from a flickering screen. Her phone buzzed with a call from Marcus, her old mentor. Marcus, once a titan of the industry, had retired into obscurity years ago. Elena answered with a bored tone. "Marcus, what is it?" His voice was raspy, laden with a gravity she found irritating. "Elena, you need to look at the foundation reports for the Heights project, not just the concrete. There's an instability in the foundation of your latest multi-million-dollar project." "I sent a letter, read it, please." The physical letter arrived an hour later, a heavy envelope that felt like a relic. Elena opened it, skimming the technical warnings about shifting soil and leveraged liabilities. To Elena, it sounded like the ramblings of a man who had been out of the game too long. Marcus was yesterday's news, a retired soul haunted by shadows that didn't exist. She felt a surge of dismissive hubris. Without a second thought, she physically tossed the letter into the trash, prioritizing a high-profile gala over a safety inspection. Her pride was a shield. "You look breathtaking, Elena," Julian said, appearing in the doorway. Her husband was the embodiment of charm, a man whose smile could soothe any ruffled feather. He adjusted his tuxedo, his eyes reflecting the same confidence Elena felt. He encouraged her confidence, laughing when she mentioned the warning. "The old man is just jealous of your heights, darling. Don't let his ghost stories ruin your evening." Julian's support was the anchor she thought she needed. Meanwhile, her assistant, Sarah, hovered in the background, with a tablet clutched to her chest. "Ms. Elena, I have concerns about the project's structural integrity." Elena silenced her with a sharp glance. She ignored Sarah's concern. The gala was a whirlwind of champagne and hollow flattery. Elena was the center of the room, the architect of the future. Before we continue, subscribe to the channel and tell us in the comments where you are watching from. When the time came for the charity auction, Elena stepped forward to make a grand and massive donation. She handed over her black credit card with a flourish. But when the waiter returned, his face was a mask of professional apology. "I'm sorry, ma'am, the transaction was declined." A ripple of whispers moved through the crowd. Elena laughed it off, her voice like cracking ice. She treated it as minor, but the seed of tension was planted. When she returned home late that night, the mansion felt unusually silent. She kicked off her heels, the marble halls pressing against her. As she stepped into the grand entryway, her eyes caught something out of place. There, stretching across the white marble floor, was a small, jagged crack. It mirrored the warning she had ignored. The jagged line on the marble floor pulsed in the moonlight, a silent accusation Elena could no longer ignore. Sleep was a luxury she couldn't afford, as the weight of the previous night's humiliation pressed against her. She retreated to her home office, a room usually reserved for victory laps. The hum of the servers felt like a low-frequency warning. The air conditioning hummed, a cold breeze that felt like the breath of her own failure. She pulled up the digital archives for the Heights project, her fingers dancing over the keys. But when she attempted to access the core structural data Marcus had mentioned, the screen flashed a blank box. Access denied. Panic bubbled in her throat. She bypassed security protocols, her eyes scanning lines of code until she found the discrepancy. The files hadn't been locked. They had been systematically altered. The soil density reports were forged. The load-bearing calculations were inflated. As she traced the digital trail, the name at the bottom of the authorization logs hit her like a blow: Julian. Her husband, the man who had toasted to her genius, had been using her credentials to mask a catastrophic financial hemorrhage. When Julian entered the room, the mask of the charming spouse had slipped, replaced by cold defiance. Elena didn't need to ask. The truth was written in the way he poured a drink without looking at her. He had leveraged her company's reputation to secure high-risk loans for failing tech startups, using the Heights project as collateral. He offered no apology. Instead, he unleashed a torrent of resentment, admitting he was tired of living in the shadow of her flawless legacy. He had tried to buy his own relevance with her success, and in the process, he had hollowed out the ground she stood on. Their argument was a collision of egos, ending with Julian walking out, leaving the mansion feeling suffocable. At dawn, the erosion of her world accelerated. The structural instability Marcus had warned about had leaked to the press. Whispered by an investor Julian had burned. The news cycle was relentless. Elena's phone became a source of constant torment, vibrating with demands from panicked board members and building inspectors. Her firm's stock plummeted in a vertical line that mirrored the cracks in her floor. Her prestigious empire was nothing more than a house of cards. The prestige she had spent 20 years building was being dismantled in minutes of digital outrage. Sarah, her assistant, sent a final resignation text, noting that the red flags she raised weeks ago were now public record. The physical toll was undeniable. Every piece of luxury in her home, the designer furniture, the curated art, now felt like a museum of her own arrogance. They weren't rewards. They were anchors dragging her into a sea of debt. The crack in the entryway had grown, snaking toward the grand staircase like a living thing, a manifestation of the rot in her life. She realized then that the warning wasn't just a technicality about concrete. It was a prophecy of a total systemic failure. In a desperate act of survival, Elena attempted to liquidate her private offshore accounts to fund a repair of the project's foundation, but as she logged into the portal, the numbers staring back were zeros. Julian had anticipated her move and emptied their joint holdings days ago. She was left with a failing building, a crumbling marriage, and a mountain of legal liability. Exhausted, Elena sat in her darkened office, staring at the city she thought she owned. The shadows swallowed the desks where her employees once worked. Then, the silence was shattered by the rhythmic flash of red and blue lights reflecting off the glass. A heavy pounding echoed at the main entrance. The police had arrived with a warrant for her arrest. As the reality of her legal collapse set in, Elena realized that Marcus's warning hadn't been a threat. It had been her final ignored chance at salvation. The sirens eventually faded into the sterile hum of a holding cell, but the silence that followed in the months to come was far more deafening. Elena watched from the back of a dented taxi as the heavy chains were wrapped around the gates of her mansion, a physical manifestation of her corporate negligence and marital betrayal. The liquidation was swift and merciless. Her firm, once the crown jewel of the metropolitan skyline, was carved up by creditors like a fallen beast in the desert. The curated art was crated away, the Italian sports cars were hauled onto flatbeds, and the designer labels that once defined her worth were packed into anonymous cardboard boxes. She found herself standing in a 400-square-foot apartment where the walls seemed to press inward, smelling of stale radiator fluid and the ghosts of previous tenants who had also met their ends in the margins of society. The high society invitations stopped arriving, and the friends who had toasted her at the gala didn't just leave. They evaporated into the ether, replaced by cold legal summons and the crushing weight of her own reflection in a cracked, flickering bathroom mirror. Driven by a hollow ache that felt like a necessary penance, Elena eventually sought out Marcus. She found him in a modest, sun-drenched woodshop on the far edge of the city, his hands covered in a fine layer of cedar dust. She didn't come to scream or cast blame for the warning she had so arrogantly shredded weeks before. Instead, she stood among the fragrant wood shavings and asked the one question that had haunted her nights: why he had tried to help someone who clearly didn't want it. Marcus didn't look up from his lathe immediately. When he finally did, His eyes were kind but weary. He spoke of his own long-lost empire, a forgotten dynasty of glass and steel that had shattered 30 years prior because he too had believed himself to be untouchable by the common laws of man and physics. He had seen the same glint of dangerous certainty in Elena's eyes, the toxic belief that she was the sole exception to the laws of gravity and ethics. He hadn't sent that letter to be right or to gloat. He had sent it because he knew the exact sickening sound a life makes when the foundation finally gives way. This revelation broke the very last remnants of her pride. Elena began to walk the city streets, not as an architect of grand monuments, but as a humble student of the pavement. She eventually found her way to a crumbling community center, in a district she used to drive through without ever locking her car doors. There was no prestige here, only a chronically leaky roof and a sagging floor that threatened the safety of the neighborhood's children. For the first time in her professional life, Elena worked for free. She traded her silk scarves for a battered hard hat and her digital models for a simple spirit level and a hammer. She felt the grit of honest labor beneath her fingernails and found a strange, rhythmic peace in the tangible reality of physical repairs. She wasn't building for a legacy or a magazine cover anymore. She was building for the vulnerable people who lived inside those walls. The final meeting with Julian took place in a sterile legal deposition room, framed by buzzing fluorescent lights and the acidic smell of cheap coffee. He looked diminished, his once invincible charm replaced by a frantic, hunted look as the legal system tightened its grip on his massive fraud. He expected her to lash out, to demand blood for the millions he had drained and the life he had set ablaze. But as Elena looked at him, she saw only a man who was still a terrified prisoner of the same shadows that had nearly swallowed her whole. She chose to forgive him right then and there. It wasn't an act of weakness or a condoning of his crimes. It was a surgical removal of the bitterness that threatened to anchor her to her past. She walked out of that room lighter than she had been in decades. A year later, Elena stood before a small 2-story daycare center she had designed and helped build with her own hands. It was modest, framed in simple, sturdy timber and bathed in the warmth of natural light. There were no marble floors to crack, no soaring glass spires to boast of to the press. It was honest, it was solid. As she watched the children run through the doors, she realized the small warning Marcus had sent was never truly meant to save her business from the bank. It was meant to save her soul from herself. She had lost everything she thought she wanted, but in the ruins, she had finally found the person she was meant to be. The foundation was no longer a hidden vulnerability. It was the strongest, most enduring part of her spirit.